Good morning. This is my Sunday school class. My name is Douglas Griffin. Today's January 28th of 2024. I'm sorry. Just you don't have to get used to the New Year's. Um, we're studying the book of Leviticus. Started in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. We're just zipping along. On Wednesdays, I'm in the New Testament. Um, Leviticus is, again, it's a difficult book unless you thoroughly understand what it's about, and it's a fascinating book to me. So we've gotten to an interesting part of Leviticus. Chapters 15, 16, 17, 18 through 20 um, are sometimes misinterpreted, never on purpose. No one thinks, I think I'll just misinterpret the Bible. But they are misinterpreted because if you read them by themselves without a context, um, then you can read it incorrectly. There are some things that go without explanation in our culture. In some parts of the country, if you say, oh, a black and white was following me, you mean a police car. In some parts of the country, you might mean an interracial couple. In some parts of the country, there's a shake, milkshake that's half vanilla, half chocolate. It's called a black and white. So you go, a milkshake was following you? And so you'd have to know the context to know when that person, when you're reading, oh, a black and white was following me. You'd have to know the fuller context to go, okay, they were driving, they were in a bad neighborhood, the siren went, okay, obviously that was a police car. Otherwise, you could read that and go, oh, a black and white couple was following this poor man. So just knowing the context, you got to know the context. In Leviticus, the context is the types of temple worship that were going on in every other part of the earth. There's only one set of people who were worshiping the one true God. Everywhere else on earth, every mile that you went, there was a shrine set up to another God. And so that's all that the children of Israel knew were the idol worship. That's all they knew. And so God's having to correct them. He says, I'm going to take you out. Oh, I meant to look up that scripture. But anyway, it's in Exodus, God sends Moses to tell his people, I'm going to send you out into the wilderness to worship me, to learn to worship me. He wasn't saying, I'm so lonely, I need you to worship me. The emphasis is on the me. I got to teach you how to worship me because all you've seen for 200 years in Egypt is worship of other gods. And so if Jacob is their father that brought them there, Jacob did not have a firm grip on how to worship God and how to pass that down to his kids, which we will see. Um, okay, so we're in Leviticus chapter 15, and we got to read the next 5 chapters again in the context of what were other cultures doing, because that's what he's addressing. What were the other cultures doing? Because that's what he's trying to correct. I'm skipping to the last verse, second to the last verse of Leviticus chapter 15, which says, thus you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness. If you follow these instructions, you'll separate them from what makes them unclean. Not sinful, not sinners, but just unclean. If you follow these instructions, this will separate them from the uncleanness. It says, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. So they're going to defile my tabernacle unless you teach them how not to bring their uncleanness into my tabernacle. So this whole previous chapter is all about how not to defile God's tabernacle, lest it says they'll die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. So God had built a tent. Now, God had instructed them on how to build a tent. And inside that tent or tabernacle, same word, he set up how to worship him. But unfortunately, all they had known for hundreds of years was how to worship in the way that these other nations worship their gods. It was really ingrained in them. They did not instantly hear the word of God and go, "Oh, I'll change immediately." Obviously, they didn't. God had to keep judging them. None of us do. So if you have somebody who's raised in a certain culture who's suddenly brought into the church, they're not going to change in one day. Uh, they're going to bring those practices with them because they think that's normal. And what other nations were doing and how they worship their gods, the children of Israel thought that's how you worship God. They had no idea that was wrong. They had no idea. They're like shocked, like, what? We can't do that? What? Everybody does that. They had no idea. So he's got to tell them. And he's listing all the things, but everything that he lists is things that will defile the temple, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my tabernacle that is among them. So I don't want them to defile it. So they're going to do these things. Okay. So um, we're reading chapter 15, but I need to give us a history. I just want to rehearse the history of what's going on. What's the story? As we know, um, there was a great flood because people had gotten crazy. God says, I got to judge everybody. There were the sons of God and the sons of men. There were the sons, like, thus you are the sons of God if you follow the Spirit of God, the Bible says. So that's us. We're the sons and daughters of God. And then they're the sons and daughters of men, meaning you're following after men. They were two separate groups, but unfortunately they got together because the daughters of the sons of men look good to the sons of God, like, ooh. And so they got together and darkness won. There's only one righteous family, that's Noah. So God says, I got to judge everything because they're doing crazy stuff. I have to judge them all. Let me start over with Noah's family. Noah has three kids, and Noah's grandson was Nimrod, who had a gift of leadership. You can have a gift of leadership, but you can use it incorrectly. He led those people who were at that time in Genesis chapter 11 says they had one tongue, they spoke the same language, and he leads them to build the Tower of Babel in a place that is currently that became Babylon near Baghdad in Iraq in that area. And then God confounded their language, but they took that idea that let us build this tower so that we can make a name for ourselves, so that we can be like God. They took that idea, and when they spread out, because they were just one people traveling together. Now they spread out, going down to Egypt, going to Persia, going to China, going to Europe, eventually going to South America and Central America. They spread out, but took that same idea. That's why you'll just see temples being built everywhere, but to false gods. That idea of let's create these gods, and there was always some priest or some person who would represent the god to the people. That's always, right? All these cultures, all the same. Like, why are they? How come these Egyptian pyramids are just like these Mayan pyramids? What's the coincidence that all over they were all taught to worship in the same way, and they simply split up? Now, right after Babylon, God illuminates one family and says, but let's follow this particular family. And it was Terah. Now, the reason Moses is writing this is that so people understand the history. Moses is through Moses, God is writing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy while they're in the wilderness. So he knows who his audience is. And that's why a few things go unexplained because the people already know what he's talking about. And I always give the example of Cain and Abel bringing their sacrifice to God. Moses has already explained you always do the sin sacrifice first. Always. You don't approach God with what you've done. You always approach it first with what he's done for you, and you approach him as a sin. They know that you always do the sin sacrifice, the sin offering first, the burnt offering. Then you can bring the grain offering. God says, I will not receive it if you do the opposite. So when he writes the story of Cain and Abel, and we see Cain bring the lamb to God, but Abel bring the lamb to God, but we see Cain bring this grain sacrifice. Everybody reading that goes, they went, oh, God's not going to like that. We're going, now why did God? Because we're not reading the whole, you got to read the whole thing in context, right? So, as far as temple worship, he's explaining here's how we got here, and this is not good as far as worshiping other gods. In Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, it talks about Terah. He's it says Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot. So Terah has three kids. Abraham's actually the youngest. He's much younger than his older brothers. His father was 130 when Abraham was born. Terah was 130 when Abraham was born. Because when Abraham is 75, Terah is 205. So he had other kids at a normal time in his 30s, 40s, 50s, and like 60 years later, 75 years, however long, Abraham comes along. His older brothers are Nahor and Haran. Haran's son is Lot. Haran dies. And so Terah takes Abraham, his son, and Lot, his grandson, because they're still young in his eyes. But Lot and Abraham are kind of the same age because how much older uh, his brother was than him. The oldest son, Nahor, he's got his own family, and they kind of stay put. But he takes them. Um, he says, and Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, his son Abraham's wife, and they went out with them from the Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. So they leave. So they're in the Babylon area, obviously learning Babylon ways and Babylon gods. That's all they know. They don't know there's anything different. They're not being rebellious. They don't know anything different. God hadn't spoken to anyone really personally since Noah, and generations have gone by. And so people have built all these civilizations. In the Midrash, Midrash, a Jewish group of Jewish writings, Hebrew writings, they say that Terah and Abraham made idols. They had a shop. So this is what has been passed down through these Jewish writings for generations, for centuries. Doesn't say that in the Bible, but they might know. They're the ones in the Bible who's talking about that not only did they worship these idols, but they actually made them. So Abraham's family is really steeped in creating idols and things like that and worshiping them. So they went from Ur of the Chaldeans, these Babylonian gods, that's all they know, to Canaan. Well, of course, in Canaan, they're worshiping all kinds of gods too, Hittite gods and Amorite gods, and they just have other names, but and they came to Haran and dwelt there. Then God speaks to Abraham and says, I'm going to make of you a mighty nation. Now, the way the gods are designed, there's a god of a specific area, like the god of Inglewood, and then the god of Westchester, and then the god of Simi Valley, and then the god of Temecula. There's just, in their minds, every god has a territory. Abraham still thinks that way, even though God spoke to him. He still thinks that way. That's why in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, it says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in Canaan. So he goes down to Egypt. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, he said to Sarah, his wife, indeed, I know that you're a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they'll let you live. Thinking, well, why didn't Abraham just trust God? Because he thought God was only the God of Canaan. Even though God came to him and said, I will make of you my man, he was steeped in the knowledge that you're the God of just a certain area. In fact, he probably thought, well, he sent me to Canaan because that's where he's God of that area. That's why he's going to give me this land and give this land to my people. Because that's so when he got to Egypt, he thought, well, God's not God here. There's Egyptian gods here. So I better lie. Clearly, that's what he thought. He didn't think God would protect him there or could protect him. Even though God said, I'm going to make you mighty man. Up in Canaan, you can do that, but you don't have any authority here in Egypt because the Egyptian gods take over here. And that's a very important way of thinking about when you're in that area, that God controls you. When you move, you go to Florida, that God controls you. When you go to Texas, that God controls you. In Nebraska, that God, right? Um, so Abraham though survives that ordeal, and God speaks to this Egyptian king because God does speak to everybody. How we respond determines our salvation, but God speaks to everybody. And Abraham makes it back up. Abraham, he has Isaac. Isaac has a very iffy relationship with God, probably because he looked up when he was in his 30s, because he wasn't six like they portray in these movies. Um, and Abraham is sacrificing him on a altar, so he's kind of like, well, now even though God was just testing Abraham, apparently that affected Isaac because we don't hear Isaac having any kind of conversation with God till way late in his life, and he finally starts building some altars. But then Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Jacob, we don't hear any kind of relationship, God ever speaking to Jacob. But everywhere around them, they're in the land of Canaan. They see all these. There's there's shrines and there's places where they're worshiping all these gods. So God's not telling them specifically. God's like, I already told you. I'm not going to say it 50 times. But this other worship goes on all the time. And so their family knows Babylonian gods, and they know this mysterious God who speaks once every 50 years. So when Jacob runs away from home because he has stolen his birthright, some part of him believes that this God's going to somehow provide this land for him. He has his first encounter with God, and God appears to him in Bethel, and he makes a vow. In Genesis chapter 28, verse 20, it says, Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me, because he's on his way up to Syria where the rest of his family is, right? His family moved up to Syria, and then Abraham came down to Canaan. They moved up from Babylon, but they brought their Babylon ways with them up to Syria, and then Abraham moved to Canaan. So now he's going back up to Syria with his family, who they've never heard from God. Only Abraham heard from God. Nahor, Laban, none of them. They worship other gods. So far, there's 3 Christians in the. So far, there's 3 Bible believers in the world. I'm joking; they're not Christians, but there are 3 Bible. There's Abraham, there's Isaac, there's Jacob, and their wives, and that's it. So there's 6. That's it. People who actually know this God on earth. There are 6 people. So when God speaks to him, it says Jacob makes a vow. Genesis chapter 28, verse 20. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I am going, and give me bread to eat and clothing to put on, so that I can come back to my father's house in peace. If he somehow protects me enough so that I'm able to come back, then the Lord shall be my God. But you're not my God yet. I don't know if you're going to be able to help me get back here where I think you're in control. So he goes up there, and he's immersed in Laban's culture and worshiping all their gods. And his wife, Rachel, is a child of Laban. All he knows is those gods. That's all he knows. That's all she knows. That's all they know. Is those Babylonian gods that they brought with them, that their family made idols. Okay. So in Genesis chapter 30, it says that Jacob decided he was going to go. And it says that Rachel stole the gods. In Genesis chapter 31, Laban comes looking for the gods. And Jan Skinner Horton was pointing out, God directed Laban. Because, yeah, God speaks to non-believers. Now, the problem with non-believers is that 99% of the time they're not believing and listening to God. So we can find those instances where that person followed God in that, look, that non-believing policeman decided not to write me a ticket. But then he went home I'm not picking on policemen. I'm just saying. Then that person went home and got drunk and beat their wives and yeah. So they had a minute where they listened. They followed God. Didn't write me a ticket. But who knows what they went off to do, right? Um, that's the problem with being a non-believer. But for a minute, Laban was actually following God's direction. Um, but he wants his gods back. So he chases after them because I want my grandchildren back and I want my gods back because I can't survive without them. Why does Rachel take them? Because Rachel's never been in Canaan. Rachel's lived her whole life in Syria. She knows these gods. I better take these gods with me. What's going to protect me when I get in Canaan? Those Canaanites, they're crazy. They'll kill me. So I got to take she's not taking them to make her father mad. She doesn't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She's never met the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we have to change our thinking. She's never met them. And Jacob's only relationship with him is that I had this dream down when I was in Bethel, down in Israel, in Bethel. And that's the last time he spoke to me. And I said, well, if I can make it back, then you'll be my God. But until I get back, I don't know that you know, these other gods may be stronger than you. That's why he says, if I make it back to my father's house in peace, then you'll be my God. But if not, then I know that these other gods are more powerful than you. So they don't know if they're going to make it back in peace. Rachel's like, let me take these gods with me because I don't know this God that you're talking about. And she didn't. In Genesis chapter 31, Laban chases them and says, and now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. I get why you left, Jacob. He says, but why did you steal my gods? Like, I need my gods back. I can't, right? And this is the culture that Rachel grew up in, that Leah grew up in, that the Bilhah and Zilpah, the two other, all four wives of Jacob, their kids are raised in this culture and their gods in the house and their gods in the living room, in the dining room, in the tent, bathroom, whatever. There are gods everywhere protecting you. I need the God of the land and the God of the tree. So the kids, that's what they know. They don't know this other God because it's problem with God, problem with the one true God. He's invisible. So it's hard to believe in this invisible God, but this God right here, that there's statues right here, I can touch him and hold him. And so it's easier to believe in that. And that's what these kids saw, those gods. So just know that Abraham's kids are very much believing in these other gods and their ways. They don't know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in Genesis chapter 31, verse 34, we read this last week. Now Rachel had taken the household idols, put them in the camel saddle, sat on them, and Laban searched all about the tent but did not find them. And she said to her father, because she's sitting on the camel, let it not displease my Lord that I cannot rise before you, for the man of women is with me. Like, I can't get up. I'm so sorry. And he searched but did not find the household idols because she wanted those idols. What's going to protect her in this new land she's never been to before from the Canaanites who are going to kill them? What's going to protect them? I got to take these idols with me. In Genesis chapter 35, after God finally speaks to Jacob again, right? He hasn't really spoken. He gave him a dream about sheep, but hasn't really spoken that much to him in the 20 years that he's been gone. Then God says to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel, go back to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother. Fulfill your promise. You said I would be your God if I brought you back. Look, hey, surprise, you're back. And Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, to his household and all who were with him, the kids, the maids, the servants, they have this huge thing. He says to all of them, put away the foreign gods that are among you. So not only did Rachel bring gods, everybody brought gods. The kids, the maids, everybody. He says this to everybody. Put away the gods, purify yourself, change your garments. We're going to start worshiping this new God. In verse 4 of Genesis 35, so they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands. They gave Jacob, so it wasn't just Rachel, all of them, the servants, everybody. They all had foreign gods. It's just Rachel took her father's gods. Rachel had her own. But Rachel took her father, Laban's God. Like, why did you take my gods? Why didn't you just take the ones you already had gods? It's not like you... But she, like, I want my father's gods because look how successful he was. Look how powerful he was. He had all this land. So the gods that protected him, let me grab those. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, verse 4, and the earrings which were in their ears. That'll come later because that's how they would melt these earrings and make these idol gods because the earrings are gold and stuff. And Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree, which is by the Shechem, which is by Shechem. Shechem. Okay. So shortly thereafter, just a few years later, Joseph grow maybe 5 years later. I think Joker's like 12 when this happens. 5 years later, Joseph is sent down to Egypt, and at 17, maybe 16 years after that, his family all end up down there. Have they suddenly become these great worshipers of God and all of that stuff? No. We know that Jacob, which I'll get to later, uh, thought he was going to a temple prostitute when he saw Tamar. We talked about that last week. So they still have the habits that have been ingrained in their family for hundreds and hundreds of years. This one experience that Jacob had with God, they had not yet had their own personal experience with this God. That's why they stayed in Egypt, as a matter of fact. When they came down because of the famine, when they had the opportunity to go back, because Jacob said, please bury me back in Israel. And they said, okay, but we're staying in Egypt because that's where we feel safe. And Joseph is there. And even though God told you, this is our land, they weren't buying it. So any stories, personal stories that Jacob had about, oh, God spoke to me. Yeah. Anyway, we're going to stay in Egypt. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, like I told you in Exodus, God comes to Moses and says, go tell the people that I want you to come out into the wilderness. Tell Pharaoh I wanted to take the people out into the wilderness so they can worship me. Because all they've learned for 200 years are these Egyptian gods. And they have to learn, I have to retrain their thinking now. They're ready now. I had to get them to the point where it got so bad that they wanted to leave Egypt. Finally, they want to leave Egypt. So go tell them they're going to worship me. And in Exodus chapter 12, before they leave Egypt, Exodus 12:12, it says, I will pass through the land of Egypt on the night. This is the final judgment that he brings on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. So I'm gonna prove to the people that I am more powerful than all the gods of Egypt. They're still worshiping all these gods, but on every single plague that we've already gone over this, every single plague was a strike at a particular god of Egypt. And so he's showing you worship this God, but I'm better. You worship this God, but I'm more powerful. Worship this God, I'm more powerful. That never stopped. Even in Elijah's day, when he's calling down fire, it's because the children of Israel who are in the north are worshiping the gods of Baal. They love to worship these other gods. And so it's like that never stopped. And so in Exodus chapter 23, as he's bringing them out, he says, you shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. I'm bringing you to the land of Canaan. Do not make a covenant with them or with their gods. Don't worship their gods. They shall dwell in your land. They shall not dwell in your land, sorry, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So this is what the book of Leviticus is addressing. I've got to teach you how to worship me and not these horrible habits you've picked up for hundreds and hundreds of years that your family brought down. But sure enough, even though God parted the Red Sea, this is why in Exodus chapter 32, verse 1, it says, now when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, come, make us gods that shall go before us. Because they want, we can go back to Egypt, right? Because that's all we know. We're just meeting this God that you're talking about, and yeah, he parted the Red Sea. But we've known these other gods for hundreds of years. So let's go back to Egypt because we're in danger here. That's why they had so much trouble believing that. We think, what's wrong with those people? Because that's all they knew were these other gods and these other habits and how those people served those other gods. In verse 2 of Exodus 32 says, and Aaron said to them, well, okay, break off your golden earrings, which are in your ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. Just like Jacob had told his family, take off your earrings, and blah, blah, because that's what they used to melt down to make these idols. And they knew Aaron, you've been making idols all this time while we're in Egypt. It wasn't even like even a thing. Aaron didn't go, what? You think I can make an idol? What are you I don't make no I don't. He said, okay, because they make idols. Their family made idols back starting with Abraham. This was not a shocking thing. So I've got to retrain you after God judges them, which really does not affect them. Bless their hearts. He says, now I've got to retrain you. I'm skipping ahead to Leviticus 18, even though we're in chapter 15, because again, we have to understand what the context of all this is. In Leviticus 18:3 says, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. He's not forgetful. He's just trying to separate. I am God's. He says, according to the doings of the lands of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. Please focus on me. All eyes on me, focus on me, look at me. Blah. But they had ADHD clearly, and they wanted to do what they had learned for hundreds of years in Egypt, and they wanted to do what the people of Canaan, and God knew that. And so I'm just pointing out, I'm just doubling down. This is what God is addressing, specific temple worship. He's not addressing their personal lives, what's going on in their personal tent. What he's talking about is worshiping gods the same way those other people do. So just like I get an example of the black and white, you have to know the context when God says something. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 30, similar thing. It says, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments. Keep mine. You shall not commit any of these abominations, either any of your own nation or any stranger who dwells among you. Don't do those terrible things that they do. For all these abominations the men of the land have done who are before you, and thus the land is defiled. They were defiling the land. This is not figurative speech. The land was the most important thing to them. They don't survive unless crops grow. They can't go to the grocery store. Oh, well, we had a bad crop this year. Let's just call Amazon and have them bring. If the land's not producing, they all die. So they would constantly felt that they would have to appease the land and appease whatever gods were over the land. If the land does not produce, whole civilizations are wiped out. So they would defile the land by thinking, how can we make sure that crops grow? Okay. Semen produces children, so I'll let my semen fall in the ground, and that'll produce the crops from the ground to make the ground fertile. Blood is what keeps us alive, so let's shed blood on the ground, and blood will make the crops grow. Because they had to figure out what's going to make crops grow. And this is what they came up with. And so it was practice all the time, and all these blood and semen and discharge from your body, they would allow to fall on the ground. They had it, and they felt it was fertilizing the ground. Made sense to them. He says, but if you do these things, the land is defiled in this way. It's not actually made better and made holy. It's actually defiled. So don't do that. Verse 28 of Leviticus 18, unless the land vomits you out also when you defile it. Has it vomited out the nations that were before you? Like, that's why they got in trouble. That's why these civilizations were wiped out, because of their practices. Verse 30, therefore you shall keep my ordinance so that you do not commit any of these abominable customs which were committed before you. So that's what he's talking about, the traditions and the customs of those people. He's not talking about their personal lives. He's talking about the traditions and customs of those people, of those lands. Don't do those things, and that you do not defile yourselves by them, by doing those things. I am the Lord your God. Those are not real gods. I am the God. He doesn't keep saying, I'm the Lord your God, because he's forgetful. He's saying this because he's trying to let them know, I'm God. Listen to me. Hello. Can you read my lips? Can you understand the words coming out of my mouth? Why do you keep following those other gods? Because the entire world was following other gods. The entire world, everywhere they went. If they went in the mountains, there was a shrine. If they went by the river, there was a shrine to a god. If they went in the valleys, if they went in the woods, didn't matter where they went, there were shrines to other gods everywhere they looked. So God has to keep fighting for their attention. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29, it says, when the Lord your God cuts off from before you those nations, which you go to dispossess, and you discipline them, and and you displace them, sorry, you displace them and dwell in their land, take heed to yourself that you are not ensnared to follow them after they are destroyed from before you, that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I also will do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. Don't do what they do. For every abomination to the Lord which he hates, they have done to their gods. For they burn even their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. They believed, it's an interesting thing about as far as the youth, and how we'll sacrifice our own children to these gods because that will appease these gods, that they want something young and virile, and and they'll even burn them. They'll go that far. God's saying, don't do that. It's weird that he had to tell them, but that's what everyone believed on earth except for this one small group of people. Did they listen? In Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, just reviewing this. And Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, right? They dwelt on the other side of the Jordan River in the old times, and they served other gods. So everybody, it says this started with Abraham's father. It started with Abraham's brother and his kids, and Lot and Laban, and all. They served other gods. We got to be honest. Now, therefore, verse 14, I'm skipping 14 in Joshua 24. Fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth. Put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Yes, you were serving these gods in Egypt. They weren't sitting there like in the good movies, like in Ten Commandments. They're so holy and they're righteous and they're oppressed and they're waiting for God, and surely God shall come and deliver us. They didn't believe that for a second. When Moses showed up, they said, who are you? We don't believe you. They weren't this group of people worshiping God. They were serving. Joshua would know. He just left there. He was a kid in Egypt. He's not making this up. Your father served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Your father served these Egyptian gods. That's what they were doing for 200 years. Moses came with something new. Jacob had had that experience, but none of his kids did. And they served these Egyptian gods. And God has to keep telling them, that's all, this is going to kill you. Please don't do this. Verse 20, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after he's done you good. So when they get there, do they listen? Let's look at the Psalm of David, 106 Psalm of David, verse 34. They did not destroy the peoples concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, but they mingled with the Gentiles and learned their works. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons. They who? Yes, the children of Israel. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. In what way? In two ways. They allowed them to be possessed by these demons, or they killed them for the demons and let their blood spill on the ground. In certain cultures, in Egypt, in Rome, I think in these Middle Eastern cultures, they would kill the kids, and then they would read their entrails to get omens from the God. That's how God is communicating. God possessed my child, and I will kill my child, and I will look at his intestines and try to read the signs and see what message God is sending to me through my child. It says, so this is David explaining this. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons and shed innocent blood. The blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood. So they would kill them and let their blood spill in the land, thinking that's going to help the land stay fertile. Thus they were defiled by their own works and played the harlot by their own deeds. This is why God would say in Leviticus 15, the woman's blood is unclean, because they thought it was holy. He's trying to correct a specific practice of killing people and letting their blood shed, thinking, now this is holy blood. No, it's unclean blood. Like they're unclean. They're unclean. I've told you you're unclean, and you're unclean until you come to the temple each day and you sacrifice an animal, and that will cleanse you. But as soon as you walk out of the temple, you're going to start sinning again. You are unclean. Don't think that your semen and that your blood and your discharge is holy. It's not. That's what those cultures believe. Your blood is unclean. So it's not, you're clean, but your blood is nasty. It's all of you is unclean. You're unclean. Don't use your blood for idol worship. Don't use your semen for idol worship. Don't use this discharge to fertile the land. It's unclean. That's why he's saying it's unclean. Okay. So thus they were defiled by their own works. Did they listen? 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 15. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies, which he had testified against them. They followed idols, became idolaters, and went after the nations who were around them. He's talking about the children of Israel, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. Don't do. So that's, God is specifically saying, don't do like them. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molded image, 2 calves. They made wooden image and worshiped all the host of heavens and served Baal. And they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire, even though God said don't do that. Practice witchcraft and soothsaying. That's, again, where they would read the entrails of their kids and sons and daughters whom they sacrificed. Sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. So, and the last thing, I'm just going to read from Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 28. When I brought them into the land concerning which I had raised my hand in an oath to give them, and they saw all the high hills and the thick trees there, they offered their sacrifices and provoked me with their offerings. Oh, look, there's some trees. Let's have sex there and let the semen run on the ground. Let's sacrifice a kid there and let his blood run on the ground. You have a discharge, let it run on the ground. Oh, so they love the thick trees and the high hills. Oh, that's a good place to build a shrine and do all these crazy stuff. He says there they also sent up their sweet aroma and poured out their drink offerings on the ground. You poured out on the ground, right? And that fertilizes. There's an African custom, that you pour out your drink on the ground and it fertilizes the ground and it brings good luck to the couple and stuff like that. These are traditions, we do them for different reasons when we pass down these traditions, but they were doing them because they literally thought this drink's going to fertilize the land. It was literal. It wasn't symbolic. We just think symbolically, but they thought literally. So, Leviticus chapter 15, verse 32. Then I'm just going to review some things. It says, this is the law. This is the very last verse of Leviticus chapter 15. This is the law for one who has a discharge, for him who emits semen is unclean thereby, and for her who is indisposed because of her customary impurity. That means she's having her menstrual cycle. And for one who has a discharge, either man or woman, and for him who lies with her is unclean. So these laws are concerning that. He's saying what I just gave you in Leviticus chapter 15 is covering those 3 things: semen, discharge, and blood. So this is the law. So that you don't do what they do. So now I'm just going to back up and review a couple things. In Leviticus chapter 15, verse 16, it says, if any man has an emission of semen, then he shall wash all his body in water and be unclean until even. It's not talking about just normal practice in your tent with your wife. He's saying this is what other people are using these things for. Don't do those things. It's unclean. It's not holy. Stop thinking it's holy. Now, I had told you about the 2 words used for temple prostitute. Used for prostitute. Zona means just regular prostitute. It's in the Bible 93 times. Kedeshah is a female temple prostitute. The word Kedesh is taken from the Semitic root meaning holy, or consecrated, or set apart. That's how you should translate it. Whenever it was talking about women, they translated that word Kedeshah. Kedeshah is the female version. They translated it temple prostitute. Whenever it's talking about men, they translated it sodomite and perverted. But it should be translated male temple prostitute because it's the same word. But the translator had their own agenda, which is fine. But it's the same word. It's talking about specifically in that situation. In that situation, this person who's set aside to let the gods inhabit them, and then you do what you want with them. And it's how I get intimacy with the God, because the God's in that person, and then I have intimacy with that person, and now I've intimate with that God. So whether it's a Kadesh or Kadeshah, that's who he's talking about. In Genesis chapter 38, it was the first time we run into the Kedeshah, the female one. We talked about this before when Judah, son of Jacob, right? When Judah's on his way to sacrifice his sheep and he's going to have a big party and give thanks to God, he's on his way there. He runs into his daughter-in-law who's ignored all these years, thinks he's a temple prostitute, and had sex with her because he's on his way to worship God. He's gonna sacrifice his sheep. He's gonna shear his sheep. They always had a big feast, and they always gave the first fruits over to God. So on the way there, hey, there's temple prostitute. We know that because in Genesis chapter 28, verse 21, when he came back, he says, then he asked them in another place, saying, where is the Kedeshah? That means the sacred one, who was openly by the roadside. And they said, there was no Kedeshah, sacred woman here in this place. And so he turned to Judah and said, which is an area, and said, I cannot find her. Also, the men of the place said, there was no Kedeshah. There was no holy woman here in this place. That's the first time we hear that word. It's only used 3 times. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 14, it says, interesting, it says, after God is so weary, he's so weary of their practices that God at a certain point lets go. That's not good when God says, okay, I'm just going to let whatever happens happen. I'm going to let that banana rot because that's the only way you're going to learn. It's like the prodigal son. Okay, just go, because the only way you're going to learn is if you end up with the pigs. In Hebrews, book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews says, if God chastises us, that's a good thing, because then he chastises us as though we're his sons and daughters. If he doesn't chastise us, then we're bastards. And so that's a bad thing. So if God's correcting you, if judgment's coming, if he's teaching you, that means he still loves you. You're still his child. He says, we had earthly fathers who chastised us, and because they loved us. Shouldn't God do the same thing? If he's not chastising you, that's a bad thing. So in Hosea chapter 4, verse 14, he says, I will not punish your daughters when they commit harlotry. I've let it go. Nor your brides when they commit adultery. Why? He says, for the men themselves go part with harlots and offer sacrifices with the ritual, with the Kedeshah. The plural of that is Kedesheth. So it's with all these women. So the men are doing this. Why am I going to get mad at your daughter? So whatever happens, you want me to punish your daughters when they do this? You want me to punish your wives? No, because you're doing the same thing. I'm just going to let whatever happens, happens. And then you'll learn a lesson. It says, therefore, people who do not understand will be trampled. So I'm going to let you have a prodigal son experience and just let it all explode, because that's how you're going to understand. Now, so far I mentioned the 3 places where the female temple prostitute is. Interesting enough, 8 times in the Bible, the male prostitute is mentioned. And I think, did it happen more often? Why is he bringing it up 8 times, but only 3 times with the other? In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 17, it says, there shall be no Kedeshah, ritual harlot, of the daughters of Israel, or, now they translated it perverted, but it should just said Kadesh, one of the sons of Israel. Neither one. I don't have either one. Don't you guys do what they do. Don't have a temple female prostitute or a temple male prostitute. And apparently that male prostitute thing was a thing that happened a lot. In 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 24, it says there were also, now again, they translate perverted persons, but it's Kadesh in the land. There were male prostitutes in the land, temple prostitutes. Again, he's talking about this specific practice. They did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. So God said, don't do it, but they were all over the place. We're talking about the male ones. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 11, it said, Asa, who's a new king, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David. He banished the Kedeshim. These are the male temple prostitutes from the land, and removed all the idols that his fathers had made, because they still, even though God said back in Deuteronomy before they ever got there, don't do this, they had been doing it for generations after generations for hundreds of years. So finally, David's grandson had to banish them all from the land. Did that stop anything? No. 1 Kings chapter 22, his son had to do the same thing. Verse 45. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat, the might that he showed and how he made war, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And the rest of the Kedesh persons, the Kedeshim, the male prostitutes, who remained in the days of his father Asa, he banished from the land. So Asa thought he got rid of them, but the rest of them he had to banish again. Were they gone? No, because it's the thing. Because you can banish people all you want, but until their hearts are changed, they're just going to do the same things. Second Kings chapter 23, talking about a different king. Then he tore down the ritual booths of the Kedeshim. These are the male prostitutes, persons that were in the house of the Lord. In the temple of God, they would set up their booths, because that's what they did in all the other places. Everywhere else that they went, if they went to a Hittite nation, if you went to, you would walk in the temple, and the part of your worship was to go up to either a female or a male prostitute, and they would allow a demon to possess them. And then you think, oh, I'm being intimate with my God. So they had them right there in the temple, even though God said, don't do that. They had them right there. And he says they were in the house of the Lord, 2 Kings 23:7, where the women would hang hangings of the wooden image. So the women would make images, statues, wooden statues of the God. Like, oh, and so you would look for the God that you wanted to, be intimate with. Oh, over here in this corner, there's Ashereth. Over in that corner, there's Baal. Oh, okay, there's Moloch over there in that corner, and so you wouldn't have to guess. They would just had a sign above them. Well, they had the actual idol above them, and you go, oh, okay, I want to be intimate with this God, and you would go there. In Job chapter 36, and of course, Job happens before all of this. He says, the hypocrites in heart store up wrath. I mean, it was just written during the time of Abraham. They do not cry for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life ends among the Kedeshim persons. So it was happening them. That's where their life begins and ends, unfortunately, because they just get addicted to this sort of thing. So, in context, this is what God is trying to prevent. He never stopped trying to prevent it for 1,000 years. Never stopped trying to prevent it. In Leviticus chapter 15, verse 18, it says, also when a woman lies with a man. So earlier, talking about this mission, it wasn't woman lying with a man. In verse 18, now we're talking about women and men, and there's an emission of semen. They shall bathe in water and be unclean. It's unclean. So whether you're by yourself, whether you're with another man, whether you're with a woman, stop using your semen for fertilizing the land. It's not holy. That's all God is saying. But he's not saying that there's something wrong with sex. He's saying sex in that specific category. And we have to remember that and carry that thought with us in 16, 17, 18, 19. He's not saying it's all bad. He's saying in this specific situation, don't do that. That's what the other nations do. And then we know the story of Numbers chapter 25. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Now Israel remained in the acacia grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. So once they got there, they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate, bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Hang them in front of everybody so they see this is bad. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to the Baal of Peor. And indeed, one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brother, a Midianite woman, in the sight of Moses, in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. He brings the woman right there in front of the tabernacle. And now when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he arose from among the congregation, took a javelin in his hand, went after the man of Israel into the tent, and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among all children of Israel. So this is something that even though they were warned, they still did. Leviticus 15:19. If a woman has a discharge, and the discharge from her body is blood, she shall be set apart 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. In Numbers 35:33, it says, so you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land. This is specifically talking about if a woman has an issue of blood, it's not holy. Stop using it. Blood defiles the land. It doesn't make it holy. And no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. If you shed innocent blood, if you kill your kids, your blood will have to atone for it. And he's saying this so as a deterrent. Don't kill your kids because then I'll have to kill you, hoping that will stop them. Leviticus 15:25. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than at the time of her customary impurity, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her customary impurity. She's unclean that whole time. Don't think, well, it's been 2 days. Surely her blood must be clean by now. If the blood is lasting for a long time, it's unclean. Now, God's not saying she's a sinner. He's just saying the blood is unclean. It's still unclean. Just like if it's 2 years, don't think, oh, she must be holy. She's been bleeding for 2 years. The blood is not holy. Stop using it in your sacrifices. That's why the woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and she was unseen. But she said, if I touch his garment, I'll be made well. So God's saying there's healing for it. Don't use it for your sacrifices. Come to the temple and I will heal it. This woman's unclean. Well, no, she's not unclean. The blood is unclean. That's what he's trying to say. I mean, yeah, she's unclean because she's a sinner like we're all sinners. But the blood didn't make her unclean. The blood is unclean. Don't use it in your sacrifices. Come to Jesus. He will heal you. Jesus turned around and saw her. Be good to your daughter. Your faith has made you whole. Okay, I'm almost done. Leviticus 15:28. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, then she shall count for herself 7 days. And after that, she will be clean. Stop rushing stuff. And just to remind you, Leviticus 15:31 and 32. Thus shall you separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness. This is how you separate them from their uncleanness, because he tells them what to do. Come to the temple and sacrifice and do this. And that's how you make it clean. It's unclean. The only way you make it clean, that's why he gives these rules. Bring 2 turtle doves, and there's a whole ceremony if you want to make it clean. That makes it clean. It's not clean because you think it is and you can use it in your sacrifices. So she says, this is how you separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness when they defile my temple that is among them, my tabernacle. This is the law for one who is to discharge, for him who met semen is unclean thereby, for her is indisposed because of her customary impurity, and for one who has a discharge, either man or woman, or for him who lies with her is unclean. So these are the laws for those particular things. This is how you deal with that. That's what chapter 15 is about, and nothing else. It's only about using these particular body fluids in temple worship, which is what the other nations did. So keep that in mind when we go to 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, that God is talking about the practices of other nations that defile them. And he's saying, don't do those things that those nations do. He's not giving a general, in all situations, you may never have a discharge. You may never have semen. He's not talking about just in this specific situations, people who are defiling my temple, doing these things. Okay, so thank you for putting up with that. We will go to Leviticus chapter 16. I just wanted to review to make sure that gets in our brains in a certain way. On Wednesdays, I am talking about, I'm in the book of Luke, and I appreciate those of you who are able to. Ooh, Jan, I'm glad. Thank you. Anyway, some people say, "Oh, I really understand that a different way. I get it now." Great, that's great. And it's just simply putting the whole thing in context helps us get a better understanding of the story. Oh, okay, that's what's going on, right? You just look at the whole thing. When you just take one little segment, you can unwittingly misinterpret. I don't believe the vast majority of the people misinterpret on purpose. Unfortunately, if you only limit yourself to one small segment, you can easily fall prey to misinterpreting. So if you look at the whole story, you'll go, oh, okay, I can see what God was talking about here. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in and for the late start. And I will talk to you either Wednesday or see you again next Sunday when we're in February. All right, bye-bye.